As you look over what we've got right now, we just had the first presidential debate. Anything strike you from what you see now to historically looking back previous elections?
They've been trying to do this stuff for 200 years. Election of 1824, which you mentioned, no one had a clear lead in the Electoral College. So there was the famous corrupt bargain. Jackson had the most votes, but John Quincy Adams got together with Henry Clay. No one can prove this, mind you, but Adams apparently offered Clay the Secretary of State-ship in return for Clay's electoral votes. Clay gave Adams his electoral votes. He had enough to defeat Jackson. This is the famous corrupt bargain, right?
Well, you know, it's interesting because today we wouldn't consider that a corrupt bargain. We just consider that part of politics. It's just you bring your constituency, I'll do this if you'll give me your folks. And so back then, it's interesting that the ethics were so different that to make that kind of a combination was considered a corrupt bargain. And I don't think anyone would raise their eyebrows over something happening like that today.
Well, and earlier in that year, John Quincy Adams held a ball for Andrew Jackson. He and his wife Louisa opened their house to 1,000 guests, and it was a way to court Jackson to maybe run with John Quincy Adams. So there was an effort there to kind of thwart the two-man race there. And Louisa got lamp oil dripped all over her dress, and everyone thought that meant that her husband was anointed to be the next president. So.
Or you could read it the other way, that that's a real mess and it may go to Andrew Jackson.
Right.
Now, you said Louisa. Was Louisa doing the ball? Was she the one trying to put together the deal? Was she? She
was the one. John Quincy said, hey, I'd like to have a ball in our home for 1,000 people. What do you think?
Oh, wow.
And so she agreed, and she took on the Dolly Madison model of opening up her home, bringing in members of Congress, trying to woo them to support your husband. And Dolly Madison really did set that pattern because in 1808, Charles Pinckney, who ran as a Federalist for president, said, I might have had a better chance had I faced Mr. Madison alone. I was beaten by both Mr. and Mrs. Madison. And so that just spoke to her power and her charisma to bring in people, make anyone feel comfortable, even her husband's worst political enemy. Everybody loved Mrs. Madison, Henry Clay said to her, and she said that's because Mrs. Madison loves everybody. She was a Quaker. Quakers didn't believe in social differences, social status, white, black, we're all equal, and Dolly really embodied that. And that was the pattern that many women followed, was to be like Dolly Madison for years.
How many races can you point to where the ladies really made a difference in the race?
I would say that one is probably the most significant, because I don't think you've ever heard, you didn't hear Jimmy Carter say I was beaten by Mr. and Mrs. Reagan. You know, you didn't hear some of that later. So it's hard to not think that maybe Dolly Madison was the most influential. But that's when Congress and congressional caucuses were determining the nominees. We now have nominating conventions. So it's just done so differently now. But, you know, as women got the right to vote, that's really when First Ladies stepped into the role that they have now of actively campaigning and going out on the stump, or whistle-stop campaigns in the 40s and 50s, what have you. It really started with the suffrage.
So what Michelle Obama is doing, what Ann Romney is doing, any historical, I mean, what do you see? Anything that looks familiar from history? Well,
certainly, I think Eleanor Roosevelt set that pattern that we see in our current women who are supporting their husbands. She spoke at the convention. I've heard commentators say that both Michelle Obama and Ann Romney's speeches were better than their husbands. And I think it was probably just because they were much more personal and more authentic.
Yeah, I really felt that Ann Romney did a ton for her husband.
Absolutely, yes.
You know, I don't mean this to sound demeaning, but the fact that she actually giggled during the speech is like, hey, we thought they were way up, you know, kind of ivory tower kind of people, and she really seems like a real person. And the way she came across with that genuineness and just the humor and literally the giggling that she did seemed to be, these are real people. Now, I thought she probably did a whole lot more to help him than what Michelle did to help Barack in that thing. But you know, that's the way it struck me watching it.
Well, and you know, Ann Romney definitely has a warmth, and I think she's filled in that human side of him. He just becomes more and more relaxed when he's around her, and you can see that they genuinely love each other. And she's a good, great, charismatic spokesman for him. I noticed that when President Obama was going on, you know, David Letterman and some of the other talk shows, she was the one who did a few entertainment shows that same week around that time period. She's a good surrogate for him.
So are there elections where the wives didn't do much? I mean, by design, they stayed out, or they didn't want to be part of it? Or
Well, Helen Taft is a good example of someone who really wanted to, but didn't feel like she could because of where things were in 1908. Apparently Teddy Roosevelt wanted Taft to run, and she wanted Taft to run, but he wanted to be on the Supreme Court, and so she really talked him into it. And she
talked him into running for president?
Yes, when she visited the White House when she was 16 and wanted to be First Lady after that. And so she really pushed him to run for president. And, of course, he did, and he won.
Well, they both got their wish because he also became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court as well.
That's right. He won.
They both got it.
But she was nervous, but she said she had to stay at home. And if she had lived in, 10 years later, probably, she would have been out there, campaigning, because that was kind of who she was. She was really a pretty good political animal. What I think is funny about William Howard Taft is that apparently a week into his presidency, he's out riding his motor car, and someone asked him, "How do you like it?" And he said, "Well, I keep turning my head expecting Theodore Roosevelt to walk through the door." He reads about the president meeting with some member of Congress, and he's still thinking Teddy Roosevelt. So I think that kind of spoke to the heart that William Howard Taft didn't have his heart fully into being president, and he really did want that Supreme Court job.
So when you look at where the women have been in this thing, I mean, when did presidential elections change in such a way that it wasn't just Congress and caucuses choosing? When did we move into the nominating process that we see today?
Well, that's certainly 1840 is considered the first modern election. Log cabin, hard cider, William Henry Harrison. You start to get buttons. You start to get campaigns. They had a thing where they rolled a ball of twine through the country, and it was going to be this big log rolling campaign where they're going to generate excitement. So that's considered by most historians to be the first real modern political campaign. And it's funny because Jackson, who came 2 presidencies before him, there was Van Buren, then there's Jackson, and Jackson's always considered this big common man president. He's the president of the common man. This is when we got common man politics, and it really wasn't. It didn't come for another, 12 of 16 years.
Wow. Well, we're going to take a break here, and we'll be back to deal with more of these presidential debates and elections and where we are as we go forward. Back right after this.